Okay. Hello everybody. Welcome back to another Stream for Science talk. Woo! You believe me doing this for like N number of weeks? I lost count.
I'm not sure either. I think this might be the fifth week.
Fifth
Is that
week?
right?
Something like that, yeah. Fifth or sixth. Yeah. Hi, hello everybody. Welcome back. We are here talking again. I am Steve from Rupeethon, and joining me is Ingrid.
Hi, I'm Ingrid from March for Science, particularly this NYC satellite.
Yes, and we are going to be chatting today. Every week we have a different topic to talk about. This week we're actually be kind of going more blanket. We're going to be talking about policy and activism in general. The general concepts of what can you do at home, what can you do as a citizen to get involved with policy and politics, and if you have a lot of concerns about what we've been talking about the past couple weeks, whether it be climate change, food policy. We've talked a lot about space junk for a little bit, which, spoiler alert, we're going to have a space talk next week. If you're very excited about that, I am. Yeah, we're going to talk about kind of where does this all start and what does it matter and mean to you. So, yeah, with.
Yeah, and just if, oh, sorry, Steve, go
No, go
ahead.
ahead, go ahead.
If you're new here, you might notice at the top we have a Tiltify campaign ongoing. All of the money that we're raising is going to support our year-round programming and more collaborations. So Rupeethon, if you are new to the channel, has been running charity streams. Typically, they run very, very long, like 12 to longer hour gameplay streams, which is how we had started collaborating to raise money for particular projects. But the chats we've been having for the last, whatever, 5, 6 Mondays now are part of an ongoing campaign to support March for Science programming in general. And again, collaborations like these with Rupeethon, which have been really fun. So if you're able to, feel free to donate, share the link with friends, all that. Yeah, and shout out to everyone who's donated so far.
Yeah, I see we got another. Did we get another $20 from last week? It looks like we
I
might
think,
have.
yeah,
That's awesome.
we made another 20 right at the tail end of the stream, which was super nice.
Oh, sweet.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a great jump. We really appreciate it. Every dollar goes straight through to March for Science. It's a nonprofit 501c charity, so every dollar goes straight through to them, and they're completely volunteer run, and they're an awesome crew. And also, right below me is a link that says tinyurl.com/strm4sci. That is the link to donate. You can also click far down below if you're on the Rupeethon Twitch page. We should have a button that just says "Click here to donate." It's big purple and gold. Please go click that. It goes right to our Tiltify page, and you can make that blue bar up at the top move even closer to the goal of $500. But yeah, every dollar matters. So everything that goes through gets used for great things like climate programming, education, the march itself, and just general outreach. You guys do more than just a march, which I think is pretty rad. Yeah. Yeah. So without further ado, I think we're gonna start off real quick by just kind of talking about March for Science. I think is the easiest way to go about this. We're gonna talk
Yeah.
about what we know as concerned citizens. So, Ingrid, would you mind regaling us a little bit more about what you do as a part of March for Science and how you got involved?
Yeah. So right now I wear two hats. In the city, I am one of the lead organizers. So I am the co-chair, um, along with Omar, who was one of the founding members as well of like the city satellite. Who's actually we're in the midst of a transition. So Josh, if he's watching, is the upcoming co-chair along with me, which is super exciting. So I do that in the city. And on top of that, I am the satellite director for overall March for Science headquarters, which I've been working on maybe like the last couple of months or so. So I got involved with March for Science, kind of. I don't want to say accidentally, but I don't think I knew that it would become like this level of involvement at the time. So if you are new to March for Science began as a single day march, as Steve was alluding to, on Earth Day 2017, and really was a response to the results of the 2016 election, similarly in vein to the Women's March, which had occurred in January a few months prior. And it, I, I want to say like the result of the elections catalyzed March for Science, but it had really been pent up around sentiments of just like disregard for science, particularly when it came to declining budgets, which was not unique to the previous administration, unfortunately, as well as a disregard for scientific information. I think we've seen, like, particularly in the last year, the amount of misinformation and how quickly it proliferates, and kind of rethinking that relationship that we have to technology. And in 2017, when the march was announced, just like as a Facebook event that had been circulating, I was a first year grad student at NYU, and I decided that I wanted to go down to DC. I asked Omar, who's been on the show before, talking about food justice, who was also another grad student at NYU, if he wanted to go. It turned into like asking our friends in the department if they wanted to go. We were like, let's rent a car. It quickly became a larger amount of people that we were like, let's rent a bus. Then we realized that we were not the only folks at NYU who wanted to do so, and that there were larger efforts from not just Tandon, the engineering school, but individual departments at the College of Arts and Sciences, the School of Public Health, even Stern, um, had interest in going. There's really like a fleet of NYU folks who wanted to go, and we learned that NYU had actually, thanks to the work of some faculty at College of Arts and Sciences, had signed on as like the first institutional or like collegiate like partner of the march, which was a big deal like for academia to really take a stance like and participate in this like mass day. So I started organizing on the school level really, and what that looked like was booking buses, finding food, and collecting money from people who wanted to go. It's a lot of emails, working with administrators and student leaders, like student council, and kind of just like figuring out that like political landscape. I think of NYU, like who to speak to about certain things. And I went, well, we went, and it was just like a very, it was like a day where I think it was more formative to me than I thought it was going to be. I had always had interest, and I don't know if we've talked about this, Steve, we might have, but I'd always have interest in science education and science journalism, and that really motivated me to do my PhD. I had started out as a science journalist while studying engineering as an undergrad. And that was what exposed me to issues of not just like science policy from this like larger funding perspective, but also meeting graduate students and researchers and how these funding rules and how politics often affected their lives. Like I remember meeting a graduate student who was telling me that the budget cuts that occurred in 2013, so under the Obama administration, were likely going to mean that she was going to be out of work and out of a livelihood in weeks coming. And that's not something that I realized the university didn't have protection from, and how like careers can just like be upended in science in this way. So going to the march, meeting a bunch of people who felt this way was really, really, I don't know the word, just like heartwarming and like, kind of like I found my people and like felt like I wasn't alone in feeling this way. And it wasn't just about doing science and being in the lab and, solving thermodynamics problem sets. And then between 2017 and 2018, I did mostly like my own like self-education around this. And by the time 2018 rolled around, that's when I was like, okay, I want to be involved with this. And Steve, you alluded to this, like beyond the march. Like I want to be involved with March for Science in a way that is sustainable and turns this like moment into like an actual movement. And that's when I had started working along with Omar, other students and faculty and staff at NYU, and then eventually that year, other folks around institutions in the city, um, to organize with the city. And I've been doing that ever since. So like for the last 3 years now. So that's kind of how it happened. And at the same time, yeah, luckily, Lucky Tran, who is the managing director of March for Science, has been like a great mentor to both Omar and me, and is actually based in the city as well. So we've been able to have that connection to the larger March for Science, like global movement that has like allowed us to do a lot of work there. So that's kind of how I transitioned into also having a role um, doing what I love the most, which is like working with the satellites, like I do in the city. That was a very long answer.
No, that's good. That's good. That's
Yeah.
content.
Yeah.
That's good stuff. No, I appreciate it. Yeah, you have a long path to this, and you're very much involved from the beginning. And I like the passion because it's weird to think that what started as a 1 day march has ballooned into literally a national outreach campaign with pretty much, I think every major city or most major cities have a satellite of some sort, correct? Or at least like metro areas. Uh,
Yeah, and not not just in the city, but also like globally. March for Science India, for example, is like very what was I going to say? Very active. And aside from like just purely like the brand of March for Science, I think we've been linked to so many movements that have like come off like um, from that day. Just like like NSPN, like oh, you're part like National Science Policy Network,
Hmm.
Women Scientists, inclusion and diversity committees like at universities. I think like a lot of folks have like those common roots. You know what I mean, roots, yeah.
Yeah.
and in March for Science, and making connections that day, which has been really wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah. It's definitely the kind of thing where 5 years ago I would not have thought. I would have thought, okay, you go into a career in science and now you just kind of sit there and do your science and you publish your results, and then maybe your results show, maybe if you're involved in climate science, you just show, well, climate science is bad or climate change is bad. And then just kind of ends
Yeah.
up on some lawmaker's desk and they just discard it, etc. So I personally have been very involved on the concept of writing for lawmakers and trying to bridge the gap between being a scientist and being involved publicly. And I think one of the great things about not just the march, but in general, I don't know, I kind of want to call it the climate rage because it's kind of what it was. Like the especially 2019, 2018 protests that have started.
The
Talked
strikes. Yeah.
we talked at length in our first week about the climate protests, the climate strike in 2019, I believe, in September, when we had like 250,000 people at Battery Park, which was awesome. So crowded. It was really cool. But I won't go over that again unless people want to hear more on that. However, the one thing that's really struck me is just, hey, we can play a role now. We can get loud. And one thing that has always driven me crazy about science communication is I've been through a lot of talks. I've been through a lot of presentations. I'm a PhD candidate. I have a master's degree in chemical engineering. I've done a lot of work with other people who are very smart, very intelligent people. And I'm also frequently reminded that they go to talk about their work and there's just a barrier of what they know and what they can communicate to you and what you can take away from a talk. Sometimes you're limited to just an hour, and sometimes you get involved in the nitty gritty details. Sometimes it's necessary if you're an engineer on a project. Sometimes you're just trying to get informed to make the right decisions, maybe as a manager, maybe as a lawmaker. So it's really hard to understand, how do you best get the point across of your work? What's important to portray without withholding important information? Sometimes this requires a lot of different things. Sometimes it requires just being straight to the point. Here's the numbers, here's comparisons. Sometimes it requires analogies and understanding what is the best way to do this. How do you keep the information succinct and like factual and not adding your own flavor to it? It's kind of like a weird balance and understanding. And also, how do you keep it entertaining? Like, I hate to say entertaining because sometimes
No,
the
it should
information is.
be, right? Like it doesn't, I feel like that's such a common misconception. I think that's where scientists probably coming in with that attitude might be where they get stuck thinking about how to present their work.
Mhm.
Because I feel like all the best talks that I've been to, I remember actually, I think it was, I don't know if you were, sorry to interrupt you as well,
Of course.
but I don't know if you were in the department at the time, but Andre, so if you're tuning in, Dr. Andre Taylor, who was a faculty member in the department that Steve and I belong to, when he gave his talk, I remember he had shown like Marvel superheroes. Um, if you ask me the context now, that's my fault. I can't remember, but I remember just like being like the passion that he had, making a connection to his work that way made it like more accessible for people like to tune in rather than just I think you had also shared like that XKCD, I can't speak today, um image of like basically just like you can't assume that people know more than they do. And I think that a lot of times, like when we're in these specialized roles as grad students or whatever, we are of course very excited about our work. But yeah, that like influx of information is like hard to mitigate, like what volume or like what speed we should be at. But go ahead.
No, absolutely. Like having some way to put everything in perspective I guess that's a good point. You need to have some sort of motivation, and it's almost like a sales pitch. And I hate to sound like Billy Mays, but you just want to say like, but wait, here's all the information. Here's more. Here's everything I got. Here's why I'm doing this. This is why you should care about what I do. You and I have sat through a lot of seminars and seminars where we have professors who are paid researchers who run labs. And I sit there and go like, thanks for talking for an hour and a half. You are very smart. What are we talking about again? Why are we doing this?
Yeah, I think like the best talks, and I think this is like why I love working with like March for Science and like thinking about science communication advocacy so much, is because I feel like I that sales pitch analogy I feel like works very, very well for like your internal prep. But I feel like the best speakers and best communicators always think about it as like a conversation between the audience and themselves.
Mhm.
I feel like, and that comes either across in the way that you're lecturing, like professors or whoever's speaking that can do it in an interactive way, or just like in the back end. Like if you are presenting a monologue, the amount of research you've done into like an interview, like the amount of research you've done on your audience and what they care about and what they know before you go into the room. But I feel like it is very difficult to also gauge that, because I think the assumption has long been, and I feel like the current political state we're in has definitely challenged this and like made people aware that it's not the case. That the lawmakers will take care of the law, the science will take care of the science, and like there's just like a trust there that is inherent, and that the communication is straightforward. But I think a lot of times, and I've learned this a lot from you, like if you're tuning in and you're interested in like how these communications are made. They give like policy memos, which are basically these briefs, which are really no more than like a page or two long. And really, the brevet. I hate to. I don't want to butcher the Shakespeare quote, but brevity, the important thing.
Yep.
I think it's like brevity is the soul of what? I don't. I can't remember anymore.
I'm a little weak on my Shakespeare. I apologize.
Yeah, it's been a while since I was in high school and read.
I can hear Amanda screaming in the other room that I
I'm
can't think
sorry,
of a Shakespeare
Amanda.
quote.
You can come in whenever you want. But yeah, just that idea that like everyone is on this time crunch and might not have that time to have that fully fleshed conversation, but that there is a channel that we can have this communication for. So I don't know, Steve, if you want to talk a bit about the work that you've been doing with JSPG, which is Journal of Science Policy and Governance, what you've learned taking courses, which I think a lot of STEM students, if you're tuning in, might not realize you can do outside of your grad program often, in learning these tools.
Oh, absolutely. So, just the general concept of policy writing. Policy writing is its own entire field. There are people who get degrees in public administration. So, I'm not speaking as any expert on this compared to those people with degrees. We had one last week, thanks, John, if you're tuning in. John got a degree in public administration and understanding what it is to write for policy. There are even handbooks and textbooks on writing for policy. But like you said, brevity, that is really the key. Uh, because when you think about it, you have what is the structure of a standard House of Rep office? You don't have just the House of Rep member sitting in their office in DC, just kind of like typing things out and writing bills all day. They have a whole team. They have uh, essentially staff, like researchers, people who do policy research and like surveys and understanding what's important in their community. They have communications people. They have a whole team that runs their office day to day, and they have a team located both in their district and in Washington. So it's a very spread out system. It's a pretty big team per rep. So you think 500 so people in the House, and then you have however many per person. That's actually a pretty sizable industry for something you wouldn't expect. So it's not like it's not like you're contacting one person with this. They actually have to get their feelers out there to see what the issues are and get involved.
Yeah.
So oh, sorry. So the general idea is you have a lot of people working, but there's still a lot of work to be done. So they're usually very busy people. So typically when you give them a memo, you want to be cut and dry or right to the point. You usually give them an executive summary, which, if you're familiar with scientific writing, that usually is essentially an abstract. Just kind of summarize the paper in one paragraph, 3 or 4 sentences. 9 times out of 10, they'll just read the executive summary. But then you can include the fine details and the justifications for why you suggest certain things. But the general point of the memo is you have a suggestion on a policy approach. It's not necessarily, it kind of is an opinion, it's kind of balanced, but usually you have some sort of like research behind it, whether it be personal research, you have literature, etc., just findings from previous policies of similar nature that have been passed, or things that might not have been considered in original bills that are being written. And you can bring up, well, here's a counterpoint to this bill, or here are 2 bills of similar nature, and you can compare and contrast them. And you can submit it to a policymaker. Let's say, for example, you have 2 bills that are very similar. They have similar goals, but different approaches, and they have different consequences because of that. And you have your representative is considering which to vote on these bills, yay or nay, for either of the two, for both, for neither. And if you are in this policy field, you can write a memo, submit it to them. Usually, if you're a policy writer of some sort, or you can submit it to a journal like Science Policy Journal, Journal of Science Policy and Governance. And in that case, you kind of compare and contrast. You do the research, the original research, and then you present, these are our findings. Ingrid and I have done this with Omar in the past. We've actually written a memo where we compared climate bills and presented them not only for the general audience of the New York State Senate, and which we did actually contact the state senators who were involved with the bills and say, hey, here are criticisms or comparisons of your bills. What do you think? Will you address these questions that we have, or these issues that we have? And sure enough, they did start to address them. It was kind of neat. They actually talked back to us and said, yeah, this is good feedback. So it's a general idea of like, what is a science policy memo? It's essentially a recommendation or a research in the field of policy and how it relates to writing better or more targeted legislation. So my work right now is I'm now a associate editor for JSPG, which is really neat. After writing 2 memos for JSPG with Ingrid and with our collaborators Omar and Neva, had a lot of fun, but now I get to be an editor, which is really neat. So we're going to be doing that for about a year or so, and it's going to be a lot of fun. I'm really looking forward to it. And yeah, getting involved in that, actually writing and editing the policy memos as they come, editing the memos as they come in, which is really neat. The stuff that's been accepted, like what is recent urgent topics in science policy. So I'm very excited. I know this is a long-winded answer too, but
No, it's great. I think there are 2 things that stuck out to me. One is like, yeah, I think something that really made the experience much more, I think less scary than I thought it might be. Reaching out to senators was how responsive they were. I think there is, like there are senators, of course, like that don't listen. They have agendas that do not represent their constituents. But as Steve was saying, they do have aides whose role is to listen and to take down what are your constituents saying. And I think something like Human of March for Science was like, that there is a scientific community that is building a voice. What that voice is, hopefully representative of also not just science, but like representing what's the most just for the communities. Like in the case of climate, what is the most equitable way to implement um, a climate like a climate education program? Does it come from standardized testing? Does it come from implementing a whole new program? How are we going to fund this? And all of those angles like coming in together. And yeah, it was really cool to see just like how the senators were like, let's talk about this. And while that bill in particular that we were interested in, I think did not make it to the legislative floor for that year. I think it's been reintroduced for 2021. The fact that we were able to have that interface, I think, made us feel like true participants in the process at least, but also did inform reiterations of the bill going forward. And the second thing is that what I think is great is that, yeah, that even though it's science policy journal or you think of science policy, there are always like these like two buckets, like policy for science and science for policy. And what's great about like these policy memos, it goes both ways, right? You could think about science policy in the traditional way of, funding for science, thinking about regulations on pharmaceuticals, climate policy. But also you could think about science policy like data collection for like your local, like, anything really, like hiring data, the way we approach public health issues in your local communities or your school or whatever it is. And it's kind of just like using that lens of a scientist and the skills we have to analyze data right in a succinct and effective way to communicate to lawmakers or whoever it is that we're trying to persuade, um, to make a decision based off these recommendations.
Hmm.
um it's tricky, but I think it's fun. It's yeah, I think
Oh, for
that
sure.
really comes out like the salesperson part
Yeah.
of being a communicator. Yeah.
And I gotta say, so these journals, this journal in particular is free, but there are other ways like science policy is communicated as well, in the form of podcast. Uh, so this we pitch our own. One thing I actually did, I was reading some of the articles from the issue, the most recent issue, and it's funny because you actually get like involved in, you find issues you never thought about, or like weird wild suggestions people recommend. You're like, what? So I think I talked about this during the talk with Omar, but I mentioned that there's the concept of reintroducing oysters to the eastern seaboard, like reintroducing populations of oysters, because their shells are actually really good at sequestering CO2. When they grow, they take CO2 out of the water, and that's how they grow their shells. So it's a way to like remove CO2 from the water, reduce the acidity of the oceans, because if you're not familiar with ocean acidification, oh, there we go, thank you. Uh, if you're not familiar with ocean acidification, if you think about like all the gas in the atmosphere does dissolve into the water eventually. There's pressure, etc. It's just diffusion. It's just a natural process. And there's always going to be CO2 in the water, but as we pump more and more CO2 into the atmosphere through climate change and pollution, we introduce more CO2 into the water. The CO2 converts to carbonic acid very easily in water when you dissolve it. And yeah, it's not good. It actually is really bad for the oceans. And one of the things to do to help reduce that ocean sink, it protect wildlife that we use for fisheries, but also just in general the fauna and flora of the undersea, is just to reduce carbon dioxide. How do you pull it out of the water? It was a brilliant suggestion. I thought it was like really neat. So it's cool to always see these like out there topics you don't consider that aren't really considered for legislation as well. What is the voice of scientists? And it's kind of like, it brought me back to think, okay, so nature science, if you're not familiar with nature, I'm going to say if you're not familiar with, Nature is just a very large publisher of academic papers. There's many of these publishers as well. Nature is probably one of the biggest ones, I would say, out there, and they now publish a lot of policy briefs with their papers. They're free, I believe, and essentially a policy brief is just, okay, we've published this article on our scientific research. Say, I don't know, I wrote a paper on the CO2 uptake of bivalve shells in the water. And that might not sound very interesting or sexy to somebody reading through Nature, like, all right, whatever, like pass to the next paper. And then you read the policy brief of what this means, what's the implication for legislation, like what are the drawbacks, the benefits, if this was implemented for like a larger scale thing, and how to do this. It's kind of neat. So that's kind of finding that interface that I really appreciate between what we always think of like the closeted scientist deep in their lab, like a troll. Like
Yeah, and I just want to add that I feel like
that's what I feel like as a grad student.
sometimes I'm seventh floor trolls.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think something I just wanted to add too is that even like I think, yeah, to Sue's point, it's like super awesome that like these initiatives like Nature's own policy briefs, JSPG, have popped up, and that these, even the nature of like talk sorry, I use nature, But the nature of talking about this relationship between science and policy is also in part thanks to the organizers of March for Science and all the folks who've been organizing around science policy before then. I think like there's always this like, debate of like, especially with like maybe more conservative scientists who don't feel like it's their place to say anything, of asking whether or not there is this relationship at all, if science is political or not. But I know, speaking safely for me and Steve, and for the viewers at home, it is. It just inherently is, because we are doing science, as you've probably gotten a flavor of over the past conversations, within the context, right, of the, the political atmosphere we're in. And we've seen that exaggerated with things like COVID and climate, but this is like not anything new to the conversation. And the willingness of publications like Nature to start publishing energy briefs, for example, based off the latest climate and chemical engineering science, and is really a move in the right direction of where these conversations are not supposed to be niche, but supposed to be like an ongoing feedback of understanding.
Mhm.
Because yeah, there are issues that unfortunately, such as climate, that have a deadline, as we've been saying,
Yeah,
to address. And the more voices we have in these conversations, the better solutions we can get.
absolutely. It it's kind of drawing back to the idea of why are we scientists? Like,
Yeah,
what are we doing this for?
yeah,
Don't you want your science to matter? We don't do science because we just want it to be shelved away forever. We want our science to matter. We do science because we want to do cool things that have an impact and improve our lives. We don't go into the lab and mix together random chemicals from a shelf just because, like, I wonder what happens. In a sense, you kind of do, but eventually there's a reason why. Then it might not be what you do on your benchtop, but it'll be feeding down into future information that eventually develops into solutions to the problems we have in society. Uh, I think
absolutely.
climate change is like the big one, but generally speaking, like understanding food research, materials for better transportation, better transport of other materials in general.
Yeah, and if you're at home and you're thinking like maybe you're a fundamental scientist, like you play with like chemicals all day, you're not sure where things are going. I've been thinking a lot about our advisor, Dr. Sahu, actually brought this up, like thinking about the overall timeline of these discoveries as well, and that your science always has a place, but maybe you don't know where it is. Yeah, and that's also okay. And I feel like the example I wanted to bring up with that is like I study, or Steve and I study nanomaterials for different applications. I'm interested in particular in lighting and other optoelectronic devices like solar cells. When I was doing my thesis writing, I discovered that this like phenomenon of electroluminescence, which now we take advantage of all the time with LEDs, was discovered in like 1907. And it wasn't until like 1960, when like semiconductor industry blew up, that someone was like, "Oh, this is actually useful. Like we can do something like this."
Mm-hmm.
But to that point, and I think Steve and I have all like we have experience with this. Like we care about climate in this way as engineers, but the two of us are not climate scientists. But that doesn't stop us from using the skills we have to participate in the conversation where we can, and also advocate for what climate scientists are saying. So I guess what I'm trying to say is like you don't have to be an expert in that science to like become an advocate for a field. Do you know what I'm saying, Steve? Like
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Absolutely. You can get involved in any way, shape, or form. Which I think honestly is a great segue because I also wanted to bring up some things about just getting involved in general. If you're cool with that, I had some
Yeah, yeah.
thoughts.
Real quick, I'm going to plug because I see we have new viewers.
Oh, sweet.
If you are tuning in, this is the fifth, we don't know what number it is,
Fifth,
week of
sixth.
Stream for Science, which is a regular collaboration between Rupeethon and March for Science. We game, we talk, it's super fun. But yeah, thank you for being here. And if you are able to, any money we raise, in the link that I'm going to drop in the chat once again, goes directly to programs like this, as well as our year-round programming, which involves a lot of the things we're talking about: memo writing, workshops for scientists, outreach around climate and COVID, and general issues of concern to the New York City community. Um, so I'm going to just drop it again, and then Steve, you can go ahead.
Sweet.
Yeah.
No, it's always good stuff. Like Ingrid just said, so 501c3 nonprofit charity. You guys do great stuff. All the money goes straight to them. They're volunteer run. There's pretty much no overhead. You guys are just like putting this right towards awesome events, which is really cool. So, what I was going to start talking about was some basic things that people. The one thing I always see is just like, how do you get involved with policy? How do you get involved with politics and getting involved with having a voice, which is really not that hard. At the very least, you can show up to probably the easiest thing for me, because I can just get on the subway in April and head downtown, is go to March for Science, go to a march, go to some sort of demonstration, discussion, etc. Get involved. There's also other groups like Citizens Climate Lobby, other groups like that have like monthly meetings, weekly meetings. I don't know the exact frequency of these things for different groups, but you can get involved in that way. These groups often do activism in their area. We also talk about We Act, which is much more specific in their work. Like it's a charity that works very specifically with addressing individual issues of climate change in New York City, like issues of low access to air conditioning during heat waves, especially now with heat island effects in New York City. We're going to keep talking about We Act like every week. I love them.
Yeah, I love them. If you're watching Sono, or you're watching,
Yeah.
just say hi.
Yeah, so but that's fine. You can get involved as a group. But what is one thing you could literally do right now is what drives me crazy is, okay, so do you know who you at home, do you know who your senator of your entire state is? That's not that hard. You only have two of them.
Or even like your community board or your city council. I feel like that's such an important place to start.
I was going to work down to there, but
oh, sorry, go ahead.
It's fine. So who's your state senator? Your senator of your entire state. There's two of them. Your House of Rep members, there's maybe a handful of them. I forget the max number per state.
I don't know.
But it varies based on your population. That's great for national level policy, but also to consider like they're making policies and laws based on your entire state. And that might not super impact you locally as much as it will other people. So you have other options. Don't forget that you also have a state legislature. Do you know who your state senator is? Do you know who your state representative is? That could be districted down to just a few towns, which is very small. I think for Long Island, it's like the entire Suffolk County is one senator, and then the entire east half of Long Island is one senator, and there's like 4 reps in that area. So it's like very small areas that you can have a representative that is making real policy that is enacted in your state. And sometimes your state policies, I mean, think about like the rights of states and how big an impact that can have. Think about how we just had a couple years ago was the big climate law that was pushed through. I'm always going to get the acronym wrong. CLPCA?
CLCPA.
CPA. I was so close.
Yeah, because climate law. Oh, I'm going to butcher. Community Protection Act.
Yes. Yes. So that was
climate leadership. Leadership.
That was a big deal for New York State. So policies like this are pushed through by state legislatures. And how do they get designed? How do they get written? You can have a much greater voice, because now think of it almost like a faculty to student ratio. If you're thinking schools, you have a much louder voice and less competing voices to talk to your representative at the state legislature level. And then, like you said, Ingrid, you could even go down further towards finding community councils, mayors, etc., boards. Even school boards have a lot of power in their area. So do you know who all of these people are in your districts? Like, who represents you at these levels? These people who are making decisions. And how hard is it to contact them? It's not necessarily that hard. They have websites. They have Twitter. They have Twitter. We contacted state senators through Twitter. Weird. Welcome to 2021, everybody. This is back in 2020, but you know.
But at least they have phone numbers.
Yeah.
Too, you know, like the traditional ways of doing it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I feel like contacting by phone is usually better, I think, right? Because you have to get somebody on the other end to answer you at that point.
Yeah, and I learned in the case of state senators in particular, their aides will, take a actual tally of how often their constituents call on a specific issue, which is how they decide what things to bring to the floor. So while it might seem daunting, and it can be, but there are often call scripts. Like I had just dropped the link to Call for Climate, which is an example of one regarding climate policy, as we love to talk about, to get you through. And the thing I think, like what Steve was saying, is like it it's something that is definitely hard to imagine doing at first, but the first time you do it, you realize it's just like a practice skill, like anything else, or not. I wouldn't even call it. You do it once, then you feel more comfortable doing it
Mm-hmm.
again and again afterwards. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the number one thing that there's this great sunrise graphic which I don't have. Maybe I'll just like post later and tag Rupeethon in it, from Sunrise Movement, that asks like, what kind of organizer are you? And I've kind of remixed this graphic to also show how these skills translate to the roles you have. And we have as scientists. Like, do you love to analyze data? Do you love to host events, plan meetings? Do you love to be the front face of an action? Do you love to run social media? Think about posts for captions. Like, what skills do you have to lend? And then after that, what resources do you have to provide? Some people, like, might not have time, but they might, if you have the money and capacity to donate even $1 a month or $1 period, that can go a long way for an organization. Or even if you don't have time to maybe lend your skills exactly, but you do have time to make a few phone calls or send a couple emails. That all matters and like adds up to these collective goals, if enough people are doing them. And then I know my shirt says it, so I have to say it. But also, like, when the time comes to, of course, vote and make sure that those around you are also voting, and have a voting plan, um, for everything from these school board positions, like Steve had mentioned, community board positions, all the way up to the state level, because these things do scale.
Yeah. I I I used to be very bad showing up to an election back when I was like 18. I mean, like, I don't know who half these people are. When I show, I'm like, cool. I thought I was just voting for president. I guess I'm voting for like state Supreme Court judge or county judge. I'm voting for. When I was in Pennsylvania, I think I voted for the tax collector. You
Oh,
vote for the tax collector.
that's interesting.
Yeah. I actually, fun aside, I did actually beat the tax collector after I voted for him. He was a very interesting
Are
dude.
they collecting tax from you?
Uh, Sort of. I had to drop off a check. And I had
Oh,
to go to his office, and I was like, "This is such a bizarre." I felt like I was at what's the scene from Harry Potter when they, uh, or is that it?
as well. Someone just said in the chat.
Oh yeah, what?
Yeah.
Uh, the tax collector, and what was that scene from Harry Potter when he's in the wand shop and there's just like boxes everywhere and just like papers and
Yeah.
there was like a
Same.
printer running just thing like I'm like, oh my god, this guy's like buried in paperwork and he comes out with a cowboy hat. He's like, what do you got for me? I'm like, here's your check, sir. He's like,
Oh my God. That's
okay,
funny.
bye. I'm like, can I get the receipt? He's like, oh yeah, scans it, gives the receipt. I'm like,
I gotta look up these rules now because, like, yeah, after I'm sorry, I don't know how to say your username. I just want to say it how I think it goes, but Reckles 928 just mentioned in the chat that you also vote for the coroner in Pennsylvania. Now I'm interested in like what these positions are, like what are the strangest ones state by state.
yeah. A lot of
Yeah, and
these,
how they're chosen. Like, why do we elect the tax collector and coroner?
I know, right?
Yeah.
Uh, yeah. So it's kind of interesting because a lot of these are uncontested positions. Sometimes you have people running on both tickets. They run on, or not both tickets, but two tickets. It's very common in New York State. You'll see like Democrat also running with working families. Sometimes they're the same candidate. Sometimes they're multiple candidates, etc. But especially with, I think judges are usually listed as both Democrat and Republican. Uh, there's no primary for them. They just kind of show up and they're on both parties. And sometimes they're uncontested. So it's interesting to see. You have a lot of, it gets a lot more complicated than just Democrat, Republican, maybe Libertarian and Green, which you have at the presidential level. The coroner is a dead end job. I appreciate that. Uh, yeah, in general, you just have other parties playing, other people who you might not expect to be involved, other roles. So this is good things to know. Like this is the first this 2020 election. I think I had like a whole list of every single candidate that was running down to like the judges. And I just kind of like marked off like, okay, what are they doing? What are they like? What's their background? Sometimes I couldn't find a lot of information on them, which is
Yeah,
okay. But as I found as much as I could, I wanted to walk in knowing who I was voting for. I wasn't going to make the decision at the board there, but I feel like that's a common thing to do. You just
it
kind of go
definitely
there for, you're saying, oh, well, it's in the party, or I like this person, etc., or I have no other choice. And you just check the box and call it a day.
Yeah, I think something that's really challenged that, and I think we're grateful like to live in New York where this is the thing, but ranked choice voting, which was introduced this year.
Mm-hmm.
I think really, and if you're in a state that doesn't have this, maybe looking into if you're interested who's organizing around this. But what people have found is that ranked choice voting, a like just like helps better represent what the constituents actually want because you don't feel this pressure of a like party alignment or just like yeah, as Steve said, like you roll up and you're just like okay, like here's some names, but because you have the opportunity to actually like rank them, you're more likely to actually read about the candidates, get to know their platforms, and think about like who do you actually think is the best person for the job based off the information they provided to you, and not just these party affiliations or you know
Mm-hmm.
their social media presence or something
Right.
a little shallow. Yeah,
And that's kind of like the nice thing where it almost protects you when, if you feel like, well, okay, I get that there's really two options who are like the front runners. And if I don't vote for this one person who I'm not super great with, it's going to be the worst person that I don't want. Uh, because I don't want to like split the vote, as we call it. Think of like the Teddy Roosevelt Bull Moose kind of party situation. That's a dated reference if I've ever thought of one. 1911 kids. But yeah, the idea of like bringing a third party and splitting your constituents' votes and then actually losing the election for your ideology overall. Uh, Ranked choice voting helps to eliminate that because you say, okay, well, I really want to vote for this candidate who I, just from polling numbers and my own gut instinct, is probably not going to win, but I still want to show my vote for that person. And then you have the ranked choice. Okay, like, well, my second choice will be who I think would be better. Like, I will accept it might be more likely to win, etc. So it kind of like does protect you in that sense, which is neat. I didn't know much about ranked choice voting until it got implemented in New York, so that was
no,
really
until
awesome.
we got the opportunity.
I was like,
It
wow,
is now I use it like we used it in the recent March for Science NYC elections, which was really cool. But
that's
yeah.
awesome.
But yeah, I think what we're trying to say is that there are just like so many levels of ways to engage, whether it's like you can offer 1 day, 1 hour, or you can really get involved with an organization. It's really just like, yeah, I think thinking about the time and resources. Well, time is a resource, the resources that you have to offer to the causes that you care about. And I think the number one thing is like the question I get to is like, how do you pick what to like do? Because there's so many things. And I feel like you just need to take the pressure off yourself. Like I always ask myself, like, what's most important to like me and where can I have the most impact? Like in my case, like I'm an educator and I'm a scientist and I'm a chemical engineer. And those things overlap really well with my job as an educator, but also with the goals that I hope to see like in climate policy, and that's like the lens that I've chosen. But at the same time, there are things that are, of course, like not to say don't care about these things, but these things overlap, paying attention to like how climate has to do with public health, has to do with immigration policy, has to do with economic policy. And just, you can find your in depending on what your interests are, um, which thankfully can be never ending. So,
Oh, for sure. I think about climate change a lot, and obviously, uh, like we said, the climate rage events of 2019, 2020, 2018, and just the words proliferation,
oh, and I got it wrong too. Yeah.
the proliferation of groups themed around this. And I sat there, I'm like, why are there so many? Like, this seems kind of fractious and weird. But then I understood that each one had their own approach and voice, and it kind of by diversifying the views, one, you could find a place that you can like fit in better with, that you feel represents your voice. You might not fully agree with the leadership of every group, even if they are, if you all are like climate change bad, you might not have the same ideas of approaches. But you have people like Citizens Climate Lobby, which is a much more widespread organization, usually separated into like community chapters. It's might be something to just find for especially more remote areas. You have groups like March for Science, which are very much justice oriented and very, I will say, no offense, very loud. You guys are very much the
That's not
voice on the
offensive,
streets.
actually. Yeah.
And if you want to
I
go
think at least
louder,
Omar would be proud.
yeah, oh, for sure. We also have, if you're much more aggressive in your actions, you have Extinction Rebellion if you want to really show how angry you are about climate. I don't say that as a bad thing. They do some cool stuff overall, but they're much more recent growth in like the idea of climate rage and climate activism. So then that's just like a handful of options. There's also student groups, Sunrise Movement, etc., who do great work, and then local specific charities. I will bring up We Act again, who work on specific projects, ways to get involved in like your community for a certain issue. It's not just one group you show up and hey, we're the group. If you don't fit in, you're not going to get involved in this science. No, you can find a group that fits you. You can also make your own. That is always an option too. There is no such thing as too many at this point. It's not like you're going to be taking away the competition. I mean, you're not just involved with March for Science. You also interface with Sunrise Movement a lot. You interface with a lot of groups, right, Ingrid?
Yeah, exactly. And I think, especially to the point about like student groups and local school boards, just thinking about the communities that you belong to, and even if there's no formal organization, just like let's say something like, well, Steve and I were like part of the same department, and one thing during COVID, for example, we were just collecting data on commute times and safety, the ways that the safety levels that students felt commuting to campus. Just being that person who's like, hey, I'm going to make the Google form, I'm going to ask some questions and report back to the group and to, administrators that can do something. That's organizing. That's getting the things together. And then, yeah, I think it kind of like snowball effect from there. And just, yeah, again, thinking about the skills that you have. And then the only other thing I wanted to add too is if you don't feel like you are ready to do that, just listening and just showing up, as Steve was saying, like going to meetings, finding out what your community leaders are doing is also really important. Just staying up to date in itself is a task that I think can start getting that mindset of like, how can you get involved? And when that opportunity is right, I think you'll kind of feel it within yourself. Not to go a little Disney, but yeah, I think you'll know.
Believe in
Like,
yourself.
yeah.
I think the main thing take away from all this too is that in general, just being more conscious and active is just the first step in like recognizing what do you know about your area, what don't you know about your area, like who are the groups that you can interface with, what can you do physically, like Ingrid said, just collecting the data, making the action step, taking the first step, even involves founding a group. It just involves like chatting with friends and eventually helping to scope these opinions out and develop it and maybe even pass this on to local legislators. Just getting these concerns heard is a big first step. But yeah, it's really just know who represents you and know your position in the politics of your area. So I think that's really something that just kind of gets like glossed over. We always forget the local elections,
Yeah,
the
it
school
matters.
board.
It really matters. Yeah.
And if you're ever so inclined, you can probably run for some of these positions if you're especially wanting to be involved, even like a community board or just being involved in the offices. So yeah,
Yeah.
just something we always forget about. Local. Yeah, and we talked a lot about a lot of things. We kind of scoped around with just general activism, policy, what it means to be a scientist in politics. And I think one thing I forgot to do earlier was talk about science communication. I don't mean to dumb down your work when you're talking about what you do. But sometimes it does help to keep things brief, but also not exaggerate, but just like shine a light on what you do. Be proud of what you do as a scientist and be like, I do this because I know it's the coolest thing, or I think it's going to be really important.
Yeah,
Take pride in that. So,
yeah, and it's yeah, I again, yeah, it's like not don't think about it as like dumbing down, but like just like yeah, like knowing who you're talking to.
mhm,
I feel like the number one thing I've learned with organizing with March for Science is like everyone has interest in science.
mhm,
They might not formally think that way because you know they first didn't study science in the way that Steve or I have, but it doesn't mean that just because you have to use language that is different from your technical jargon in your papers that there is no way to get that. Even if all they care about is like I work on lights and all I can explain to them is like why an LED is better than a lamp. Cool. Maybe I don't
mhm.
have to explain my synthesis process or why I don't actually emit light from my material to them. But there's an in somewhere to get that line of thinking going. Yeah.
And I mean, like we the one thing that comes to us a lot is we are nanomaterial scientists. By nanomaterials, we're talking nanoscale being what's a good
Like the size of a virus, the size of DNA.
yeah, essentially. Like I'm always trying to think of a good scale. That's the one thing I can never really like explain. But a couple hundred atoms,
Yeah.
where if you remember from high school chemistry, a mole is like times 10 to the 22 power, whereas that's
23.
23 power. Sorry, yeah, I'm 6.022. My bad.
Yeah.
I know, right? I'm a
Mm-hmm.
chemist. So I'm
A
also tired.
biochemistry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I always joke that I'm an engineer before I'm a chemist sometimes, even though I'm doing a
Me
chemistry
too.
degree.
Even though we did chemistry for like 5 years, I'm an engineer.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, no, so it's definitely we talk a lot about these concepts of what is a nanomaterial, like what is nano. And then we get into fancier words like saying, what is quantum confinement? Ooh. I don't want to drag some people, but we were in a meeting recently where somebody was explaining to high schoolers, so you should be aware of quantum confinement. You probably heard of this in your physics class in high school, and I just kind of, nah, nah. I didn't even know what quantum confinement was until I got to college, until I got to grad school.
I was
So
just gonna say I didn't know till I joined the group.
exactly.
Yeah, that it even existed. Yeah.
And quantum confinement sounds scary. It sounds really fancy, but essentially it's just this effect where, if you want to think of it this way, the smaller and smaller a material gets, the less it acts like the material it is. If you have gold, a brick of gold looks like gold, but it's nice and shiny. It's worth a lot of money. But as you get smaller and smaller and smaller, down to like I don't know, a couple like 20 nanometers in diameter for these little particles, the color that they show changes. It actually like shows up red or blue, depending on the size, because it absorbs light of different wavelengths. It no longer acts like gold anymore. So I think you had a good explanation of this, Ingrid, where stained glass windows was it in like
Yeah.
the
In the medieval
Renaissance?
times, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, basically we we'd been painting with gold and silver nanoparticles for a long time, but we didn't know why. We just knew that when we did this chemical transformation, I say we as if I was like a medieval Renaissance painter,
You
or
weren't?
like a now you know. Um, but what these painters found was that yeah, when they dissolved and did this chemical reaction to these metals, that rather than having gold and silver bars as we know them at macro scale, they were able to dissolve them in solution. So you might even see in beauty products now like colloidal gold. Um, but at small enough particle sizes, these metals were instead looking like blue or red or green. And the reason that is because now to get to like the science portion of the evening, I suppose,
Yeah.
because if you're familiar with like why metals are metals, basically they have an excess of electrons on their surface, which is why they're conductive. Which is so like when you want to, um, conduct electricity through a wire. Sorry to use the same term to explain. Right, you connect like a copper wire or a gold wire, or some kind of contact from one end to the other, and that's how the electrons travel. Um, but when you get to the nanoscale, what you're doing is, again, it's not quantum confinement in this case, but you are restricting because of the number of atoms that you now have is much less versus like a large gold bar. Um, it starts to kind of feel the surface more of what's going on. So rather than having this like excess sea of electrons, you get this like now I'm explaining poorly because I haven't done it in 3 weeks. You get a different surface. You basically get different surface chemistry that now causes the color to change, or the light interactions to change because they all depend on electrons.
Mhm.
If you are a Silicon Valley fan and you've watched Richard say, like what happens, like like you go get your breakfast and like you're eating scrambled eggs, and he's like, it's electrons. It's like awkward, but it's like unfortunately true. So you can think about it that way. But yeah, maybe one day I could do. We might bring our March for Science seminar series back, and I could do a real talk on nanoscience.
That'd be great. We've been
Yeah.
talking a lot about policy, but I would always love to talk about like just straight science. I feel like I do that a lot as a grad student, but it's fun. It's part of
Yeah,
what
I
I do.
haven't thought about straight science in 3 weeks. So
I know, right?
oh no.
Congratulations,
Yeah.
Professor Paredes. Uh, yeah, no, I'm still doing chemistry from the get go, and I still sit there and say I walk into work and I'm not like science, science, science. I sit there and go, okay, how do I best do this experiment to save myself money on the materials, time, so I can graduate and
Sanity.
publish these results and not waste time. I want to find stuff that does not work, and I will report the stuff that doesn't work alongside the stuff that does to save other people time.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's just I sit there and I'm like, okay, so I have to now sit here and do an optimization problem. Okay, what combinations of solvents will I use today? Blah blah blah.
Yeah, I
Uh,
think that reminds me, like going back to a point we were making earlier about like communication and like I feel like you had said it earlier that scientists tend to when they walk in the room. I think the assumption, I think it's the nature of like our field too, where we want to feel, and most likely we are like the most knowledgeable person in the room on that specific thing. But doesn't mean that we have to have all the answers. It just means like we did what you said, Steve. We spent time researching and experimenting. We have experience to talk about. And I think that the same goes for organizing. Like you might feel if you're a scientist at home that you have no idea like what the space is and that it's intimidating and you have like no idea where to jump in because you're used to like being the person that provides, right, and like does research. But at the same time, at some point in your career, you had to do the literature review, you had to listen to the other experts and also take in information before you did the experiment. I think organizing has a very similar dynamic that way, where if you're just like willing to listen, the more returns will come to you instead of being like like trying to invent something new or like brute force your way through a project.
mhm.
Um, yeah,
That's yeah, I get it because I mean that's what we're doing here. We don't talk about the topics. I mean, we talk about climate a lot because you and I do a lot of climate work, and today policy and activism. But we didn't talk about food science ourselves. We brought in Omar, who is like an expert on the concepts of food policy and justice because that's what he
what
spent
he
like
worked on.
several years working on. We brought in John because he literally did all of his work on cap and trade, and I learned so much last week. I actually went back and re-listened to it because I'm like, I just want to hear that explanation again. Uh, and next week, good segue now because I think we're getting ready to wrap this up. We talked a lot about
Yeah,
activism and climate. Sorry, climate. What we did, but politics, policy.
always talking about yeah.
Yeah, if you guys have any more questions, please feel free to send them forward. But otherwise, we're going to start to wrap up here. But next week, we're bringing in one more expert. We are bringing in a someone who can talk about aerospace, and we talked a lot about last week. If you were here, we had a conversation, almost like a weird tangent. I asked a question. Okay, like we're gonna shoot this trash off into space. Do we care? Do we care if we like shoot junk like trash on our planet, or more realistically, like you're talking about nuclear waste, it needs to go somewhere. You're talking about any like carbon sequestered from carbon capture. What if we just launched it to Jupiter? What would happen? Do we care? There's nothing on Jupiter. Jupiter's just a bunch of space dust. Uh, Kind of understanding this idea of like environmental stewardship because my brain says, well, yes, I do care. It's part of our environment, but also part of me is like, well, there's nothing there. So we're going to bring in Scott, my buddy Scott, who is working in the aerospace industry, works in space launches, etc., and can talk more about environmental stewardship in space, the concepts of space junk, and what it means to us and what do we care about. So I'm very much looking forward to that just because I do love talking to him about space in general, and I feel like it's one field, one space that I don't know much about. So I'm very excited for it.
Yeah, and it should be good. If you enjoyed learning a bit more about like science policy that we've talked about, um, sorry, I was just reading the comment in the chat. Yeah, no, we'll walk through a bit of history too, because I think it's fascinating about how we came to kind of develop science policy and how that was rooted like in the space race and the Cold War
Mhm.
in the early 1950s, and how it's kind of tied into this kind of like tech bro colonialist attitude that has approached space. But yeah, I'm super excited to talk to Scott and learn more about like how we think about these things and what work is already being done um, to address these issues. Should be good.
Yeah. In the big scheme of the universe, shooting waste or junk into space shouldn't matter. I understand that, and I get that feeling. We also talk about low orbit stuff like just space junk in general. Does that affect us around the Earth? Do we know we have successful launches of trash into space? I always just think about the Futurama episode. I know I referenced this last week, but they launch a ball of trash into space in the year 2000, according to them. And then in the year 3000, it comes hurtling back to Earth because it just had its own orbit. And like, that's all I could think about. Like, we're going to get hit with a giant flaming trash ball.
I just think of Katamari every time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you got to put the stars back in the sky. I love that game.
Yeah.
Rupeethon stream for science. Next one will be a Katamari. Oh God,
I might just have to do it myself sometime.
let's do it. Katamari stream. I am down.
Okay.
Uh, yeah. So thank you everybody. Remember, we have the donate link down below. Please give some love to March for Science. They do great work. 501c3 nonprofit. You guys do awesome stuff, and just it all goes towards climate education, the march itself, just general outreach, and you guys did like voter education drives as well. You do a lot of online stuff too, which makes it a lot more accessible now, especially during these times. So it's really cool stuff. But
Yeah, and I'm just gonna, yeah, thank you so much, Steve. It's always like, I mean, obviously I have fun talking to you. I'm also gonna drop our Twitch channel if you're interested in subscribing to both us and Rupeethon.
mhm.
It'd be really awesome. We'll be back next week doing these, and eventually we'll play Katamari. So that should be fun. Yeah.
Katamari. Sorry, that's gonna be stuck in my head now all night. All right, thank you all so much, and have a great week, great night, great whatever. Let me just get us back to our waiting room. Bye.
All right.